From Apostate Prophet says the Quran describes disbelievers, including Jews and Christians, as quote-unquote worst of creatures and quote-unquote less than cattle. Does Daniel agree this fits with the Sharia law?
Well, Islam is universalist, as I mentioned, and it says that belief in God and accepting of God's messengers is an important part of being a good and moral person. And rejecting God and rejecting his signs, rejecting his message to humanity, the Creator's message to humanity, this is a very immoral thing to do. In fact, it's one of the most immoral things to do.
The apostate prophet raised a powerful and necessary question, and I'm glad he did. It's a great question to ask a Muslim friend or acquaintance, calmly, sincerely, and without hostility. Do you really believe that Jews are the worst of creatures? Referencing Surah 98:6 of the Qur'an. This question is revealing, and how someone answers it can tell you a lot about where they stand, theologically, intellectually, and morally. Let's break down the possible responses. 1. If they say no, that they don't believe that, then they are, by definition, rejecting a clear verse of the Qur'an. That makes them either a liberal Muslim, which is a welcome step in the right direction, or a culturally Muslim individual who doesn't take the Qur'an literally or doesn't understand the Qur'an. Either way, this may be a sign of independent thinking and a crack in the absolutist framework of fundamentalist Islam. That's promising. Support that, not attack it. 2. If they deny the Qur'an says that despite the verse being clear in virtually all mainstream translations, some Muslims may claim it doesn't say that, or that it's misinterpreted. In that case, you're dealing with either intellectual dishonesty or a lack of basic familiarity with the source material, i.e., someone who has never truly read or reflected on the Qur'an. It's not a great sign, but it's not the end. These people are often reachable because they haven't committed deeply to the ideology. They may have inherited their beliefs passively. You can gently encourage deeper reading and expose contradictions over time. 3. If they say, yes, they do believe Jews are the worst of creatures. This is the most serious response, and sadly, some will say yes. They will affirm that Jews, along with disbelievers in general, are eternally damned and inherently vile. Here's what you need to do. First, stay calm. Do not lose your temper. Getting angry, calling them names, or shouting about racism will only entrench their beliefs and make you look unstable. I've seen many well-meaning people react with shock and rage, but all that does is push the other person further into the ideological bunker. Second, understand the context. This person has likely undergone massive ideological conditioning. They've grown up in an environment where these views were normalized and reinforced repeatedly, in sermons, schools, and possibly family discussions. They may have never read a single serious critique of Islam. They've been fed lies about Jews, Christians, and the West, and rewarded for regurgitating hatred. This is not just bigotry, it's indoctrination, and it's tragic. 3. Plant a seed. You won't de-radicalize someone in one conversation. That's not how human psychology works. But you can open a window, a crack in the certainty, a moment of doubt, and that's where real change begins. So what can you say? Here are some possibilities. Adjust based on tone and relationship. Can you think of a single Jew you know personally who fits that description? Any that are kind, intelligent, moral? This humanizes the target of the verse. Do you think God, if he is just, would damn someone forever for simply being born into a different faith and not converting? This raises ethical questions that bypass direct criticism of the Qur'an. Have you ever read a book or watched a debate that presents the other side? Not to agree with it, just to understand it? This introduces the idea of intellectual exploration. If Islam is true, it can handle criticism. Why not listen to other views? This appeals to confidence in truth and discourages censorship. Your tone here is crucial. It should be curious, not combative. Don't make it about winning an argument. Make it about inviting someone to think, perhaps for the first time in years. When confronting these deeply ingrained beliefs, remember, your goal isn't to destroy the other person. It's to rescue them from the grip of toxic ideology. That takes patience, clarity, and restraint. You may never see the fruit of the seed you plant, but it may take root later, when they're finally ready. And that's how change happens.
Well, Islam is universalist, as I mentioned, and it says that belief in God and accepting of God's messengers is an important part of being a good and moral person. And rejecting God and rejecting his signs, rejecting his message to humanity, the creator's message to humanity, this is a very immoral thing to do. In fact, it's one of the most immoral things to do.
Amazing. There's no denial at all from him that this is what the Qur'an says. He just goes along with the explanation, as if it's perfectly normal to dehumanize Jews and Christians. Notice how he doesn't even flinch. No discomfort. No hesitation. Just calm acceptance of what should be a deeply disturbing teaching. That's how normalized this kind of rhetoric is in his worldview. His conscience has been so thoroughly conditioned, or corrupted, that hearing Jews and Christians described as the worst of all creatures doesn't even raise an eyebrow, and that in itself is alarming. So let's walk through Surah 98, Al-Bayyina, in its full context to see just how unjustifiable this verse is, and how clearly it promotes unjust religious supremacism. The disbelievers from the people of the book and the polytheists were not going to desist from disbelief until the clear proof came to them. Already we see the framing. Jews, Christians, and polytheists are grouped as disbelievers. It claims they would not leave their error until a clear sign, Muhammad or the Qur'an, arrived. Now, ironically, this verse, perhaps unintentionally, gives a positive portrayal of the so-called disbelievers. They don't just believe blindly, they wait for clear evidence. That's a commendable trait, to require reason and proof before accepting a new prophet. And yet, despite that, Muslims today rarely offer robust evidence for Islam. Instead, they often expect blind submission, while the Quran itself says people won't believe without clarity. The irony writes itself. Of course, the real reason Muslims struggle to provide convincing evidence is because once you examine it honestly, the Quran and Hadith don't hold up. They're riddled with inconsistencies, scientific errors, and moral failures. Verses 2 to 3. A messenger from Allah, reciting scrolls of utmost purity, containing upright commandments. This claims the Quran is pure and full of upright laws. So apparently when it says in Surah 9:29 to fight the disbelievers until they submit, that too is an upright commandment. Compare this to the Bible, which calls Israel to be a light unto the nations. The Quran, by contrast, calls for militant confrontation with the nations that disbelieve. But sure, all religions are the same, right? Verse 4. It was not until this clear proof came to the people of the book that they became divided about his prophethood. This refers to Jews and Christians, the people of the book. The Quran claims they were united before Muhammad, but became divided once he appeared. In other words, their rejection of Muhammad is not presented as theological disagreement, but as rebellion against divine truth. It's not a matter of debate, it's a moral failure. Verse 5. Even though they were only commanded to worship Allah alone with sincere devotion to Him in all uprightness, establish prayer, and pay alms tax. That is the upright way. This asserts that Jews and Christians were always meant to follow Islamic-style monotheism, praying to Allah, giving zakat, and submitting to divine commands as Muslims do. So in this framing, their refusal to accept Muhammad is essentially a betrayal of their original religion. And that betrayal leads directly to what comes next. Verse 6, the infamous verse. Indeed, those who disbelieve from the people of the book and the polytheists will be in the fire of hell, to stay there forever. They are the worst of all beings. Here it is, plain and brutal. No ambiguity. Those who disbelieve in Muhammad, including Jews and Christians, are described as eternally damned, consigned to hell, and the worst of all creatures. Not misguided, not wrong, not in need of correction, the worst of all creatures. No attempt to soften it with, in that time, or under certain conditions. It is an eternal moral judgment on anyone who refuses to accept Islam. Verses 7 to 8, the contrast. Indeed, those who believe and do good, they are the best of all beings. Their reward with their Lord will be gardens of eternity, under which rivers flow, to stay there forever and ever. Allah is pleased with them, and they are pleased with Him. This is only for those in awe of their Lord. This is the contrast. Muslims are the best, rewarded with eternal paradise. Everyone else, including decent, moral, truth-seeking Jews and Christians, are called the worst of beings, condemned to hell. This is a black and white tribalistic division of humanity. Muslims, best of creation. Non-Muslims, worst of creation, the attempt to limit. Verse 6 to back then falls apart. Some try to soften the verse by claiming it only refers to Jews and Christians at the time of Muhammad. But let's apply some logic. If verse 6 is limited to back then so is verse 7. But Muslims still believe they go to paradise for belief and good deeds today, right? So clearly verse 7 is timeless in the Muslim view, which means verse 6 is too. You can't cherry pick. If the Muslims are the best of creation part is eternal, then so is the disbelievers are the worst of creation. And even without verse 7 and 8, nothing in verse 6 suggests a time limit. That's an invention, a desperate attempt to make the verse sound less horrifying than it is. So what's the honest response to this verse? Reject it. Reject the claim that good people are the worst creatures just because they reject a 7th century Arabian prophet. Reject the idea that eternal damnation is the fate of sincere, intelligent, moral non-Muslims. And if you're a Muslim reading this, have the courage to admit this verse is wrong. You don't have to defend it. You don't have to twist it. You can be better than the text. Because if you don't push back on this, if you accept that people are the worst of creatures for believing differently, you're participating in a dehumanizing ideology. And history has shown us over and over where that leads.
Well, Islam is universalist, as I mentioned.
Islam is universalist, meaning that Islam is not just for Muslims, it's for everyone. According to Islamic theology, everyone should be Muslim. Islam isn't just a personal path to God, it's presented as a global system meant to govern the world, spiritually, legally, and socially. So when people say diversity is our strength, that concept doesn't exist in traditional Islamic thought. Islam does not celebrate pluralism in the way modern liberal democracies claim to. In Islam, unity through submission to Islam is the strength, not diversity of thought, belief, or religion. In fact, Islamic history and doctrine are filled with attempts to eliminate religious diversity, not promote it. The Islamic vision is one of religious conformity, not multicultural coexistence. Islam sees unity through Islam as the ideal, not through competing belief systems, sects, or ideologies. Diversity in matters of essential belief, such as theology, law, or ultimate truth, is considered misguidance or division, fitna, not strength. Not all diversity is good. There's such a thing as healthy diversity. Diversity of ideas, talents, creativity, and compatible cultures living side by side, exchanging knowledge and enriching one another. This is the kind of diversity that leads to progress, innovation, and understanding. But there is also toxic diversity, when fundamentally incompatible cultures collide, particularly when one is supremacist or expansionist. When one group believes its values are absolute and must replace others, diversity stops being a strength and becomes a source of conflict and instability. In that case, it's not multicultural harmony, it's cultural warfare. The slogan diversity is, our strength is a prime example of what I call slogan morality, using catchy, feel-good phrases as if they're serious ethical frameworks. They sound nice, they're easy to repeat, but they lack nuance, logic, and wisdom. These slogans avoid the hard questions. What kind of diversity? Diversity in what context? Is this diversity compatible with the host culture's values and laws? But in a society where most parents don't teach critical thinking, most schools don't teach ethics, and the media thrives on emotion over reason, these shallow slogans catch on. They become dogma, and we're left with a population that repeats mantras rather than thinks through principles. This foolishness has consequences. It creates a society where real threats can't be named, harmful ideologies can't be criticized, and genuine moral clarity is lost in the fog of feel-good soundbites. If we want a strong society, we need more than slogans. We need discernment, courage, and the return of wisdom-based morality.
And it says that belief in God and accepting of God's messengers is an important part of being a good and moral person.
Believing in a higher power, living ethically, or showing compassion isn't enough. According to the Qur'an, as we've discussed, if you reject Islam, it doesn't matter how moral or kind you are. You're not just misguided, you're considered the worst of all creatures, condemned to eternal torment. Let that sink in. Not only does Islam claim that non-Muslims cannot be truly good, but that they are the lowest form of life, destined for an eternal torture chamber. simply for not believing in Muhammad. But does that actually correspond to reality? Do we really see atheists, Jews, Christians, or Hindus living in ways so evil that they deserve to be burned and tortured for trillions upon trillions of years, without end? It's hard to imagine anything more disproportionate, and it becomes even more absurd when you look at what's happening in the real world. Many aid workers risking their lives in war-torn Muslim countries, people delivering food, medicine, shelter, are atheists or secular humanists. They're helping Muslims in desperate situations without any expectation of conversion or reward. And yet, according to traditional Islamic belief, many of the very people they are helping believe these aid workers, these kuffar, will burn forever simply for not accepting Islam. What kind of moral universe is that? One where those who save lives are damned and those who dehumanize them are blessed. That's not divine justice. That's theological insanity. This isn't to say that all Muslims personally believe this, or that many don't wrestle with these verses. But this is what the scripture teaches, and it's time we stop pretending otherwise. A belief system that tells people the most compassionate, selfless individuals are the worst of creatures simply because they don't share a specific theology needs to be challenged, not excused.
And rejecting God and rejecting his signs, rejecting his message to humanity, the Creator's message to humanity, this is a very immoral thing to do. In fact, it's one of the most immoral things to do. Associating partners with God, creating idols to worship in place of God. These are some of the worst things, the most immoral things to be done.
Most people in the world are not Muslim, but it's inaccurate to say they've rejected Islam. In reality, most of them have never seriously considered becoming Muslim. And why would they? Where is the compelling evidence? What reason do they have to upend their worldview and accept Islam as the final truth? When Muslims use the term disbelievers, or say non-Muslims have rejected Islam, they're begging the question, assuming the truth of Islam from the start. It presumes that everyone who isn't Muslim has heard the message, understood it clearly, and deliberately chosen to reject it. But that's just not true. Changing one's worldview is hard, for anyone. Whether you're a Muslim, Christian, atheist, or anything else, it's extremely difficult to abandon the beliefs you were raised with, especially when those beliefs are woven into your family, culture, and identity. We all know how resistant people are to change, even on trivial matters, let alone matters of faith and eternity. And yet Islam teaches that non-Muslims are expected to do exactly that, to overcome their upbringing, question their deepest assumptions, resist social and familial pressure, and then embrace Islam, or face eternal damnation. How is that fair? How is that justice? If you're born into a Muslim family, you're taught from birth that Islam is true. You're surrounded by religious reinforcement. Your identity is shaped around it, and apostasy is discouraged or even punished. But if you're born outside of Islam, say into a Hindu or secular household, you're expected to independently discover that everything your family believes is false, reject it, and convert to a religion you may barely understand. That's an unequal system. It gives Muslims a massive head start and demands exponentially more from everyone else, under threat of eternal torture. What kind of divine justice system punishes people not for rebellion, but for being born in the wrong house? We live in a world filled with chaos, distraction, and hardship. Wars, lies, corruption, economic struggle. People are juggling work, family, health problems, and sometimes poverty. Who, in the midst of all that, has the time or mental space to research global religions? And even if they do encounter Islam, perhaps in passing, through a news story, a conversation, or an online comment, it's unlikely they'll interpret it as compelling, especially when it conflicts so deeply with what they were taught. And yet, some interpretations of Islam teach that merely being aware of Islam's existence is enough to make a person accountable, and if they don't accept it, they burn forever. To be fair, some Muslims argue that people are only culpable if they've received a clear, undistorted message of Islam and knowingly rejected it. And I think that's a major improvement. It's more compassionate and much more aligned with reason and fairness. But let's also be honest. That's not what the Qur'an says, at least not in the verse we're dealing with. Surah 98-6 does not include qualifications or nuance. It does not say, those who received the message and rejected it. It says, indeed, those who disbelieve from the people of the book and the polytheists will be in the fire of hell, abiding therein forever. They are the worst of creatures. There's no reference to context, awareness, or level of understanding. Just a blanket condemnation of those who don't believe. So while I deeply respect Muslims who take a more merciful view, let's be honest about the text itself. The verse, as written, is cruel, absolutist, and completely out of step with what we know about human nature, psychology, and moral fairness. A God who creates people with wildly unequal access to truth and then punishes those born into the wrong environments with infinite suffering is not just. That's not a system worth defending. That's a doctrine in desperate need of revision or rejection.
Associating partners with God, creating idols to worship in place of God. These are some of the worst things, the most immoral things to be done.
Why are people still creating idols today? In most cases, it's simply because that's how they were raised. Idolatry often continues out of cultural tradition, not malicious intent. People grow up in environments where this is normal, and they never seriously question it, just like people born into any belief system. Morality is deeply tied to intent. If someone worships an idol not out of rebellion or evil, but out of ignorance and inherited belief, and if no one is directly harmed, then while idolatry may be theologically wrong, it's not morally monstrous in and of itself. Yes, idolatry is criticized in monotheistic religions, and rightly so, from their perspective. But let's distinguish between unintentional error and deliberate evil. Often, the real problem with idol-worshipping systems is the immorality that surrounds them, whether that be ritual abuse, injustice, or corrupt priesthoods, not the mere act of bowing before a statue when done in ignorance and peace. And let's be perfectly clear. When it comes to criticizing the moral failures of other religions, I'm not interested in hearing a single word from an Islamist who proudly defends things like child marriage and wife beating. You don't get to lecture anyone about idolatry or morality while justifying practices that are objectively abusive and harmful. The real evil is defending the practice of adults marrying little girls. You want to talk ethics? Start by condemning your own house's rot before pointing fingers at others. Otherwise, your moral outrage rings hollow and reeks of hypocrisy.
And so this is the moral vision that Islam offers, and there's a lot to say about that. There's actually a video that I'm going to publish in about a week called The Genius of Islam, Episode 3, that's going to talk about the evil of idol worship and associating partners with God. And so I invite everyone to watch that for a more detailed elaboration of this.
The moral vision that Islam brings? Well, I'd love to see an honest video from a Muslim, particularly a fundamentalist, detailing what that actually looks like in practice. And no, I'm not talking about liberal Muslims who pick and choose the best parts and reject the violent or oppressive aspects. Liberal Islam, in many cases, isn't the problem. In fact, if Islam were entirely shaped by its liberal interpretations, emphasizing justice, kindness, personal freedom, I might not be having this conversation at all. The real issue is radical fundamentalist Islam, the ideology pushed by Islamists, the ones who believe apostates should be executed, the ones whose moral vision includes throwing gay people off rooftops, the ones who think women must be beaten into obedience, as per Surah 434, the ones who want to enforce blasphemy laws with violence, not debate, the ones who think religious minorities must be subjugated under Islamic rule. That's the moral vision I'm concerned about. The one that seeks to suppress dissent, punish freedom, and sanctify cruelty under the banner of divine law. So until that version of Islam is rejected by the mainstream, until it is openly confronted, don't expect me to applaud when someone says Islam has the answers to today's moral crisis, not while it continues to breed the very crises it claims to solve. Can we also expect a video, perhaps from the same people defending Surah 98 and 6, that explains the evils of dehumanizing entire groups, the endorsement of child marriage, the permissibility of wife beating, or the violent subjugation of non-Muslims, all while insisting that there is no compulsion in religion? When is that video coming out? Oh right, never. Because these aren't misinterpretations or fringe ideas. These teachings are found in the core texts of Islam. That's why we don't hear these topics addressed honestly, because doing so would require acknowledging what the texts actually say, and many would rather deflect or sanitize than confront the issue. Now let's talk more about that phrase, the worst of creatures. What does that actually mean? Does it imply that Jews, Christians, and other disbelievers are worse than animals? Because that's exactly how it sounds. Worse than murderers? Worse than predators? The language is absolute. It offers no nuance, no context, no qualification. And yes, that includes Christians, even though Surah 582 paints a very different picture. You will surely find the most bitter toward the believers to be the Jews and polytheists, and the most gracious to be those who say, "We are Christians." That is because among them are priests and monks, and because they are not arrogant. Here, Christians are described as gentler, more humble, and more inclined to kindness than Jews. The verse clearly creates a distinction. Christians are not as hostile as Jews. So here's the question. If Surah 582 praises Christians as more gracious, how do they still end up lumped together in Surah 98:6 as the worst of creatures alongside Jews and polytheists? If they're less arrogant and more sincere, why are they equally damned and dehumanized? Is this not a contradiction? Because you can't claim that Christians are distinct in character, more gentle and open, and then give them the exact same judgment as those labeled enemies. That kind of moral flattening, where everyone who doesn't accept Islam is reduced to the same hellbound status, is both incoherent and unjust. And I'll say this. I'm grateful that my religious convictions don't require me to resolve these kinds of contradictions. I don't have to twist reason to defend what is clearly indefensible. This is, without a doubt, a ghastly topic, but it's also an important one. There's a reason critics of Islam frequently point to Surah 98:6, because it's one of the verses that cannot be defended without distortion. All the so-called defenses involve inserting context that's not there, rewriting meanings, or ignoring the plain reading of the text. So if you're serious about understanding Islam, or challenging it, this is a must-know verse. It tells you everything about how the Qur'an views those who refuse to accept its message. Thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share.